We are delighted to welcome back to the stage Miss Libby Casey from the Washington Post for a VIP armchair dialogue regarding the U.S. national strategy for the Arctic region. Other panelists will include U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski, Ambassador David Balton from the Office of the President, and Mr. Douglas Jones with the U.S. Department of State. So please join me in welcoming panelists and Libby to the stage. Thank you.
All right, we are in the home stretch here, but this is an incredibly rich opportunity to hear from you all about the U.S. national strategy for the Arctic region. Welcome, Senator Murkowski, Ambassador Balton. Also, of course, we have with us Deputy Assistant Secretary Jones. Thank you so much. Senator, let's start with you. This was completed and released in October. How significant is it to get this updated strategy, and also what are you looking towards in terms of implementation? Let's talk about the short term, even in the next year or two.
Well, I think it was I believe it was the Arctic ambassador to Iceland that on a panel earlier today, he said something to the effect of, you can have a strategy, but if you haven't developed it, or if you haven't implemented it, you don't have anything. And so, quite honestly, I have been really very pleased that we have seen various Arctic strategies. We've got five of our military services that have newly revised Arctic strategies. We have the national strategy that is vital and important and updated since 2013. But it's all about implementation. Nothing matters until we're able to implement. And so, moving out quickly to demonstrate what a national Arctic strategy really means. Demonstrates the commitment, not only a commitment that we look to as an Arctic nation, but that our other Arctic nations look to, and quite honestly, nations around the world look to. And I think our strategy, our national strategy, is perhaps just a wee bit more important. And maybe I'm being a little parochial here, but for a while, the United States was kind of slow to the Arctic game, and we talked about that in many, many forums. We were there, but we weren't really there in a robust way, in a meaningful way. And so it's one thing to have the strategy, the written piece of paper, your 4 pillars, and everything that follows underneath. It's another thing to put it into place. And so I think we've seen some things in just the past couple years now with implementation that is meaningful. When you think about economic resilience, if you will, look no further than what we're doing with the infrastructure bill. Look no further than what we are doing to help build out our Arctic infrastructure with regards to polar security cutters, what we're doing with the Port of Nome and that deep water expansion. These are significant, not only indicators, this is the action plan. This is putting it into place. And it is other component pieces. When you think about the health and the well-being, you can't have healthy families, you can't have healthy communities unless you have water and wastewater. We heard from the mothers in Newtok and McDarvik about what it means when you are still a community that is on a honey bucket, what it means to have your children that are dealing with respiratory issues when you don't have adequate and safe housing. So we're putting money, we're putting resources to the strategy. And we're also doing that through some of the personnel that we're put in place. The fact that we will have a U.S. ambassador to the Arctic, the fact that we have put in place permanent the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, what we've done to build out the Ted Stevens Arctic Security Studies Center. These are people to the policies that I think demonstrate that there is action. There is action behind just the strategy itself.
Ambassador Balton, you were involved in the strategy a decade ago. You were also involved in it back during the George W. Bush era. So you have some history in this. Can you give us a sense of how this strategy obviously it's very different, but how it's matured and grown, and give us a sense of perspective of how it's changed and why it's had to change.
So our nation has long-term and enduring interests in the Arctic. And if you go back and look at the past strategies, there was one in the Clinton era, the one in the George W. Bush era, one in Obama years, and now our new one. What strikes me most, and I think would probably strike you most, is actually the continuity of certain themes. And they boil down to 6 propositions. These are, I think, our basic interests in the Arctic as reflected by all of these. We need to promote our national, and I would say homeland security. We need to protect the Arctic environment. We need to promote economic development. We need to honor our commitments to Arctic indigenous peoples. And if you work in the US government, that is both a legal and a moral commitment. We need to understand the Arctic better by promoting scientific research. And we need to promote international cooperation to keep the region peaceful, rules-based. This strategy, of course, emphasizes certain things over others. Part of that is this administration differs a little bit in its attitudes, but at least 2 things have changed significantly since our last strategy in 2013. One is the climate situation in the Arctic has grown more acute. We've heard a lot about that over the last 3 days. And if you read through our new national strategy, there will be significant language about that and commitments to do things to try to address the climate situation. And then the other thing, of course, is the geopolitical circumstance. You know, our strategy was almost ready to come out in February of 2022. In retrospect, it's probably a good thing it didn't. It would have been a bit tone deaf if it had come out at that time. But then we needed to figure out how to adjust the draft strategy to account for the changed circumstances. On the one hand, this was a strategy that's intended to look out for 10 years, and it couldn't focus only on the current moment. On the other hand, it had to address the very fundamentally changed circumstance in some important way. And I think if you read through it, you will see how we tried to balance those particular attitudes. So those, Libby, I would say, are the 2 things that are particular to this strategy, along with maintaining continuity of many of the basic themes you'll see in the earlier ones.
So that pause that happened on the strategy in February, it then came out in October. Mr. Jones, can you talk to us about balancing the short term and long term when it comes to the international picture and how you take into account the situation with Russia, but also countries that have ambitions in the Arctic like China? And how do you balance looking at a year out? No one can control what Russia does except for essentially one man, Vladimir Putin, no one in this room. So how do you balance action versus reaction?
I think Dave's done a good job outlining sort of the new circumstances that we're facing here, and Russia and its aggression against Ukraine is certainly number one, and the impact that that's had as a threat to the principles that we've relied on for decades to provide order and stability and prosperity in the Arctic, in which that we want to preserve. I'd add to his list also, you referenced other nations. I think also what we're dealing with intensified challenge from the People's Republic of China, which is increasingly seeking to exert its influence, its presence, and a role for itself in governance in the Arctic, and also economic presence in often using coercive means to gain that presence, which is a challenge. And I think all of these new dynamics have highlighted within the strategy the imperative of international cooperation. So, because none of these challenges, old or new, are ones we can really address alone. So climate change, also the security and geopolitics confronting the challenges and threats from Russia and from China. Also, I would even argue on the economic development piece, increasingly we need to work with those like-minded allies who and partners. And so the international cooperation is a fourth pillar of the strategy, but I'd say it's actually sort of infused in all of them. And that's something else that's an increased emphasis in this new strategy is the need for and the imperative for international cooperation. On your question about short and long term, and I think also getting to what Senator Murkowski was talking about, we are implementing this strategy already. In many ways, it captures things that work that's in process. From the State Department perspective, we often say in the Arctic, presence equals influence. So you need to be diplomatically also present. So we, for example, reopened our consulate in Nuuk, Greenland, 2 years ago, which had been closed for decades. We've created new positions, new Arctic Watcher positions. So we have diplomats stationed in Arctic nations around the world that focus only on Arctic issues. And in addition to the new Arctic Ambassador at Large, which we hope will be confirmed soon. These are sort of examples of the way we're already stepping out to implement this strategy.
How do you balance the strategy and the domestic goals with, and I'll stay with you for a minute, Mr. Jones, about the other changing pictures globally? We're seeing Finland. It looks like it's just days away from entrance into NATO now that Turkey has cleared the way. How does that affect how you then look at this document and think about the pillars and also implementation?
Well, on that specifically, on security, we are facing rising geopolitical competition. We see it with Russia. We have to, Russia is trying to assert that through use of force, it can ignore the rules of the international order, things like recognition of borders, sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. This is not, if Russia is allowed to gain or any way prevail in this conflict, it's going to create a world that none of us will want to live in. And we have an interest in upholding these principles of international order. And this is a common view of all of our allies. So we're really enhancing our cooperation with our allies. We need stronger deterrence and defense also in the Arctic as well with Russia. And that's something we can do through NATO. So it's great news that Finland will soon be in NATO. It's going to make NATO stronger. It's going to increase NATO's ability to deter and defend allied territory, and we hope Sweden will quickly follow. These are will be great allies, and they're going to help us in the work that we're doing to bring the allies and our partners together that share our commitment to these principles. To provide for a stronger defense, both of our national security, but also of our allies.
Senator Murkowski, as we look at the principles of the strategy, how do you incorporate them and make sure that in your role in the Senate that they are adhered to and followed and can be like the North Star of how to follow the strategy, everything from consulting, coordinating, and co-managing with tribes, ensuring that there is cross-sectional coalitions built, a platform for innovative ideas. How do you ensure that that happens?
It's a challenge. It's a challenge in a Senate or in a Congress where we are still dealing with a view that the Arctic is a long ways away, and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And why are these Arctic initiatives so expensive? And that must be just another Alaska-related priority. So we'll put that on the stack of lists that the Alaskans are asking for. We've got to make sure that people understand that these are not Alaska's priorities. These are priorities of this country as an Arctic nation. That's why I'm very pleased that several House members are here from Utah and from Maine to really help us put that all into perspective. We need to do a lot more of that type of outreach to make sure that there is this understanding, because there's a competition for resources out there. We're going through the budget process right now. We saw it play out a little bit at the end of last year, where we thought we had reinforced clearly the need for a commercially available icebreaker to be kind of that gap filler as we're waiting for the polar security cutters to come online. And at a moment of competition for resource, I think you saw the funding for that go down to help reinforce Homeland Security's budget down on the southern border. These are initiatives where, again, if we're going to reinforce this national strategy, we need to get the buy-in from Congress, from an administration, that these are our nation's priorities. And it is a hard task. We have made gains. We can't make gains fast enough, in my view, but it still remains a challenge. From my part, on the co-management side, we are working not only within the authorizing committees on the Indian Affairs Committee, working through the appropriations to help not only ensure that we have opportunities for co-management, for instance, but that we're then able to provide for resources to allow for these convenings, allow for the co-management and how that can best be facilitated on the ground. So much of this continues to be an ongoing education effort. We have to do more, I think, at the congressional level to make sure that colleagues from around the country understand that it's as important to you in Iowa or Connecticut that we adhere to these principles. It helps mightily when the administration has leaned in. And I'll credit the Biden administration for really, I think, early on, coming to the table and listening to some of the priorities that we have been outlining and working with them to help facilitate. That makes a difference.
The Biden administration has said that crafting and then updating, really, that the policy, the strategy, the Arctic strategy was an elevated priority, along with, of course, some other big ones on the international stage. Ambassador Bolton, I want to read to you the first sentence, which you could, I'm sure, recite by heart, of this executive
summary. The United
summary.
States seeks an Arctic region that is peaceful, stable, cooperative, and prosperous.
Okay, I have prosperous and then cooperative,
Okay.
but I'll give you 9 out of 10. I understand there was some debate about whether that, boom, like that big sentence right at the top, which really sets the tone and sets the agenda for the entire strategy. I hear that there was some debate over that.
There was after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That sentence had been drafted before that. And the question arose, I think everybody can understand why, should that still be the first sentence of our strategy? Should it be the way we lean into this? And ultimately we decided yes, to keep it, even though some elements of that may be harder to achieve. These are still our goals. This is still the end state we hope to achieve. And this is frankly still the signal we wish to send to the world. This is the Arctic we want, even if it may be more challenging to get there.
What does success look like 10 years from now to follow that premise sentence in terms of your portfolio?
Well, I think it was important that sentence remained, because for a strategy, you have to set out a goal of what you're trying to achieve. And it's true, we're facing more threats, more challenges, particularly to the peaceful part of it, with a Russia that's pursuing a war of aggression and isolating itself on the world stage. But we think it is still achievable in the Arctic context. So this is why it's important that we maintain strong deterrence and defense. That increases our chances of maintaining peace in the Arctic, frankly, and we'll do that both nationally, but also in cooperation with our allies and partners. And I think that international cooperation will help us achieve as well, particularly on the economic front. As well, we're going to have to work more together with our like-minded friends and allies as we pursue those goals.
So of the 4 pillars, we talked a lot about number 1 and number 4, security and international cooperation and governance. Let's hit on numbers 2 and 3, Senator Murkowski, climate change and environmental protection, and then sustainable economic development. They are intertwined with the other ones, of course. But talk to us about how you hope those fit into the strategy for the Arctic.
They are absolutely intertwined. And when we think about the economic development, I mentioned earlier, the infrastructure bill, the benefits that will come from that. We have the IRA that is also going to be very helpful from the climate change perspective. But just think about the intersect here. As we say, well, we need infrastructure like water and wastewater. If you are not doing the necessary and really valuable work to address erosion issues. I'm thinking of Utqiagvik, where some in this room will have an opportunity to go tomorrow. You look at the threats to their utility systems there due to coastal erosion. We don't want to be making investments in our infrastructure that won't be enduring because we're dealing with the ongoing and ever-present threats from climate change. And so how we work to make sure that they are knitted together, that there is that grounding in understanding how we can build resilient communities in all aspects of the word. We go further behind instead of making the gains that we need. So the implementation side of this, I think, is being facilitated by legislation that we have seen put in place. The focus on what we can be doing to reduce our emissions, cleaner energy, resources. We started that with the Energy Act of 2020 with the authorization. We did the infrastructure bill. We've got the CHIPS bill. We've got the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. We have put in place a lot of the building blocks that will help us get there. The oversight on this, I think, is going to be our next big challenge. The oversight in how we do it and do it right instead of trying to push money out the door because the money's there on the table right now. These have to be lasting. This has to be built smart. The economic development that we're talking about, the balance that needs to be had between resource development and care for our environment. That's something that here in Alaska we've done smartly and wisely for a long period of time, but we're going to be even more challenged to be even more attentive as we see the impacts from climate change. But we recognize those resources that we have allowed us to build out the level of innovation that we have needed to be able to be responsive to an infrastructure and economies. And so how we achieve that is our biggest tension right now. And there have been a lot of conversations that have gone on at this conference today where you see the juxtaposition between climate change and economic development / resource development. They are not mutually incompatible. They cannot be. We have to attend to the environment, but we also have to acknowledge that we're going to continue to need the resources that not only Alaska hosts, but so many of our Arctic nations host.
Believe it or not, we are about out of time because we need to get everybody to the breakout sessions. But I just want to ask you this, Ambassador Bolton, to close. What does this document give you the power to do? What does this help you do as you engage internationally, but also domestically? It's not that thick. You can't really whack people with it.
Domestically, it gives me the opportunity to be the nanny. We are turning that document, which is only about 12 pages long, into a 50-page plan which will specify for every sentence in there that begins with the words, "we will," there will be text about what are the next steps, which federal agency is in charge, who are the supporting agency, where are our external partners, the state of Alaska, Alaska Native groups, international partners, how do we measure progress? So I can then, not just me, but a lot of us, can ride herd and make sure we actually do the things we say we're going to do using the resources that Senator Murkowski has already addressed. So, and internationally, I think now people see where we're headed. This is a good thing.
All right. Senator Murkowski, Ambassador Bolton, Mr. Jones, thank you to all of you. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you.